Well, hello there YouTube, and welcome to the continuation of this Rembrandt master study. So if you missed any of the previous videos for the process for this Rembrandt master study, please see the previous uploads in my YouTube channel. So this episode is going to be pretty fun. So with this episode we're going to mix up the skin tones, and I'm going to show you a system of skin tone mixtures that I use for my online students. So you're going to have a brief introduction to the type of skin tone palette organization that I introduce to my students. Now remember, as I always say with these YouTube videos, please do not confuse this as a free online lesson. This is just going to be a brief version of how I teach color to my my online students when it comes to portrait painting. So there are two ways to approach color when you are working with portrait painting. Actually, there could be numerous ways to approach it, but let's just simplify it down to two. So one is mix and go, mixing as you go. So mixing as you go is something that you want to do if you're working with an impressionist style of painting. So basically dab, dab, mix, 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 mix as you go. If you are constantly changing the colors and the hues in your painting, that is if you're doing an impressionist style painting or a contemporary realist style painting. The other way is going to be what we're going to do today, which is going to be a systematic approach to mixing colors for your portrait paintings. So this actually leans a little better towards a master study, because in classical times, you know, Rembrandt wouldn't have had all of these colors, so instead we're going to utilize a very minimal array of colors. So let's just get right into it. So you're going to organize it into a set of rows. So this top row is going to be basic skin tones, so generic skin tones. The next row is going to be orangey skin tones. Then you're going to have pinkish skin tones, and then from the pinkish you're going to go into the orangey greenish, so let's just say the greenish skin tones, and then you're going to go into the bluish skin tones. So let's get into that very shortly now. So I'm just going to start off with lead white, and I'm going to use a very simple color, which is orange ochre, which is a Rublev color. Now I introduce my students to these pre-mixtures using the Zorn palette. I'm not going to use the Zorn palette for this demonstration, but for my online students I do recommend them use the Zorn palette first. Okay, so that's just orange ochre and lead white. So now we're going to use orange ochre again, lead white, so basically doing the same thing, but I'm going to darken it now. So I'm going to darken it with cadmium red and viridian. Those two are complementary colors, so they will actually neutralize each other quite nicely into a really nice and simple skin tone. So a little bit more cadmium red. And there you go, very simple mixture there. And again, my palette is kind of a mess because at this point I kind of don't clean the colors off, and it's more of an artistic choice. I really like seeing the palette evolve from many different paintings, so it's more of just kind of an artistic choice. But when you're doing pre-mixtures, it doesn't really change much. So I'm going to do just one more pre-mixture. So I'm going to just have three. So I'm going to use, this one is a Rublev color, orange molybdate, or molybdite, I don't really know how it's pronounced. I used a little bit of alizarin crimson. So the reality is I'm showing you a system of how you can organize your colors. Okay? I'm not telling you what colors to put into your pre-mixtures. Okay, so this is going to be a system of colors, not how you mix the colors. It's a system, so it's an organization, how to organize skin tones on your palette. Okay, so after mixing them together, that's going to be my third darkest value, and that'll probably be for shadows and midtones and all sorts of things like that. So next we're going to create an orangey mixture. So usually Zorn palette for me means yellow ochre and cadmium red deep, and it's really one of the purest oranges that you can use for classical skin tones. Obviously, if you're painting a model in sunlight, in a bright, backlit sunlight setting, you're going to want to use, say, like cadmium orange. So for a Rembrandt, I don't think we're going to need that kind of saturation. So we're just going to omit that color. Okay. So let's let this be the middle value for the orangey tones. And now we're going to add orange ochre, lead white. Now for those of you that are confused about lead white and why we use lead white instead of titanium white, the thing about lead white is it allows you to use more of it without raising the value too much, which allows you to have more subtlety in your mixtures. And it's also just more stable. It's more solid than titanium white. More about that later. Okay, so that's the light orangey color. And now for the dark orangey color, I'm going to go right into cadmium orange and dioxazine purple. So, of course, they kill each other off. So I no longer have the bright saturation of cadmium orange, nor do I have the saturation of dioxazine purple. So what I'm left with is a brown. Very similar to what you'll get from the Zorn palette, but with much less work. Okay, so from the orangey, we're going to move to the pink. So I'm going to start off with, of course, cadmium red and white. And that is as pink as it's going to get. So this one is a little more simple. So depending on your model, if your model leans towards a more like pale skin tones, then you might want to mix some alizarin into this, or maybe sneak in a tad bit of viridian. So this mixture is about as simple as it gets. It's just lead white and cadmium red. So for the darker pink, we're going to use alizarin crimson, cadmium red, and you know what? We're not going to have anything anywhere near that saturated for this Rembrandt. So I'm going to kill it off a little bit with viridian. So of course with the Zorn palette it would be just ivory black and red for this, but I'm adding some brighter colors into the mix. But let's add a little more of those simple colors like black and red. Okay, next we're going to get the orangey colors. So for the Zorn palette, it's very simply, let's just take all of it. It's going to be yellow ochre and black. And this gives you the Zorn palette green, and that's pretty much the only green that you're going to need. Notice I'm allowing some of the pink to get into it because we're not going to have that much of a bright green. Remember, we did start this painting with a verdaccio, so a lot of the greenish tones are already answered for. Okay, so I'm just going to go to Viridian and black for the darker green. Of course, allowing some of the red to get into it. This is why I said if your palette is a mess, like mine is, I kind of like that it was a mess, because I like that texture to the palette because it's kind of an artistic thing. When you do premixtures like this, it doesn't matter because you're going into your premixtures anyway. Now we're going to mix the bluish colors, and for the Zorn palette, it's typically just black and white. So ivory black and lead white gives you your bluish color. So this will be the middle bluish color. I'm gonna need a little more lead white. So I'm using Williamsburg Flake White. Sometimes I switch around and I'll use Rublev lead white number 1 or lead white number 2. But for now I'm just using the Williamsburg. So a little bit more white, and there's the lighter blue. Obviously I could go right into these bluish colors and make it even more saturated if I want to, but for a Rembrandt we don't need to do that, and we probably shouldn't do that for a Rembrandt. All of these colors are on my palette again because I am working on other paintings throughout the week. And there it is, that's the bluish color. So that is a very brief and abbreviated version of this system of colors that I use for my online students. And you manipulate the system of colors. So typically we actually have 5 per row. And you have seen some of this actually in some of my live streams that I did in the past. But again, usually for my online students, I have different variations, so a different orange, a different pink, a different green, a different blue, depending on the skin complexion for the model that you're painting or the master study that you're doing. So these are your local skin tones. Okay, so we started off with the local skin tones, meaning these are the closest to matching the true colors on the skin tones. These are all different hues, different variations, and it is arranged so that the values go from light to dark. So now let's go ahead and go into another mixture, which is going to be our glazing mixture. So we are going to glaze over this before we go into these colors. So from this point on in this master study, I am going to be referring to the pre-mixtures on the palette. Pre-mixture skin tone light is right here. Pre-mixture skin tone orange is here. Pre-mixture skin tone pink, green, and blue is here. So now we're going to make the color that we're going to glaze. So obviously I'm going to start off with something similar to what we had before. So I'm just going to use up all the orange ochre that was on the palette. Raw umber. Orange ochre, raw umber. And we're going to want to glaze it darker and more orangey. So let's go into cadmium red. And I'm going to add a little bit more of the orange ochre. Alright, so we've added a little more orange ochre to the palette. Let's add this to our pre-mixture. Now you see how red this is. I'm going to use a little bit of ivory black and yellow ochre. So which is again the Zorn green. And let's see if this will work out. Obviously, I'm not going to glaze with just straight up paint, so I'm going to add medium. So remember, I'm using Neo-Megilp. And now we're going to get a brush to glaze. So once I'm done with the pre-mixtures, and handling the lead white paint. Pretty much good to go to take the gloves off, and then of course I get paint on my hands. So be very careful about not getting paint on your hands. So let's see what this glaze looks like. So it's obviously very orangey, so I'm going to add more Neo-Megilp. So the more Neo-Megilp I add, the more I'm able to thin it out. So this works fairly well with the shadows, not so much with the skin tones. So I'm going to stop there with the skin tones and just continue to glaze this into the shadows. Okay, so after glazing it in the shadows, we're now going to adjust that premixture. Okay, so it seems that the premixture went wrong with it was just too much orangey. So I'm throwing in Viridian. Now please know your color wheel. So adding Viridian on its own with a Rembrandt is not a good idea. So I'm adding the Viridian in here to kill off the bright orangey tones. A tad bit of white. Now obviously it has Neo-Megilp in it, so I don't have to add any more. So let's go ahead and recharge the brush with this and see how it does. So the first thing that I'll do is take off the first glaze, which whenever you do this, it automatically makes it better. I don't know why this is, but it tends to always have that effect. So with the paper towel, I have subtracted some of the paint. But of course I left the glaze in the shadow alone. And now we're just going to return to the glaze and hope this is a little better. And what we want is to uniformly darken it so that we can go in with the lights and continue to define the form. Which it seems to be doing pretty well. Okay, good. So now we're going to be able to go in with the lights. So I'm going to be going in with a small Sable brush, and we're going to be pushing the lights again. Now the difference between this layer and the previous one is that we have all of the information that we painted in last time, and we're only going to just be building onto it. So each iteration of this process makes the painting stronger. And a very valid question is, do I use this approach in my own painting? And the answer is, I have used this approach in my paintings in the past. However, I typically use a more direct approach to painting. But the transparent effect that you get from this type of painting is unmatched in direct painting. You just can't get this kind of glow to the color using direct painting. So basically now I'm doing is just going into each one of the lights and adding more form yet again. However, now that I have those pre-mixtures on my palette, I'm going to be able to change the hues whenever I need to. And at this stage, you're going to be able to build the painting towards a finish. It doesn't look anywhere near like it's going to be finished, but this is now going to lead us into that stage. And this bluish tone is just black and lead white. Believe it or not, it looks that blue. And now this is going to get more pink. And the nose is going to be a pinkish orangey. I added more orangey dark for the edge of the nose. And this is just straight up lead white. See how it's blending very nicely with the glaze? So more pinkish orangey, the cheekbones. And of course, when things need to go darker, use the pre-mixtures now. So on its own, that tone is way too orangey pink. So now I'm going into the greenish. Some more greenish for the facial hair. And at this point, you're probably wondering, when is the impasto going to come into the mix? And that's actually going to begin in this layer. And you're going to want to use your pre-mixtures to do this. So I'm going to show you one section of impasto, and then I'm going to continue building up the light around the face. So one of the best areas to start with your impasto is in the cheekbone, either the cheekbone or the forehead. So use your pre-mixtures and add heavy paint. And now you're going to have the benefit of the previous layers underneath. And you're going to be able to use your pre-mixtures to modify your colors. So this is different to how I introduced impasto painting in my previous Rembrandts. So in the past we went right into this, which is much harder but more efficient. This technique, we're adding it later, so we're adding it into an already defined structure. So now we're just going to continue to render out the face, add more structure where it's needed, and we will return in just a minute. And there you have it. So many different plane changes between the start, where we had started adding light from up here, down here, and basically the topmost facing planes of the face, and then basically just building those lights, as we said before, adding the impasto paint little by little. So first figure out the value that you want, and then use your pre-mixtures to add thicker impasto layers to the paint. So what goes next after this is going to be building up the painting to a finish. So after this point, glazes will no longer be needed, and it's going to be just pieces of different individual values and colors that will eventually fit in together, as you're seeing here, starting to develop within the eye. So it is kind of a time-consuming process. So you will be seeing the completion of this painting in the next video featuring this painting, but I do have some other projects in mind. That being said, I really hope that this video on a system or organization of skin tones on your palette, and of course the glazes and the layering techniques, have helped you out. Remember, if you want to take your education with me further, please check out my online classes on Patreon. The link is linked. The link is in the description box of this video, along with information on which colors I used, and of course the rest of the painting materials that I'm using. That being said, I wish you the very best in all of your artwork, and I'll see you on the next one.